Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Breaking Barriers, the Mental Health Podcast. I'm Lizzy.
And I'm Camilla.
And we're joined today by someone very special, Emily, with Women in Distress. She is absolutely, I can't say enough wonderful things about her. When I met her, I just thought, my God, this person is a light in this world, and she really has to just educate all of us. We're going to talk about domestic violence, toxic relationships, how to identify those patterns. So much.
Yeah, lots to talk about. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
And it's so important for us to be talking about this because domestic violence, it comes in different shapes and forms. So it's very important to be aware about it and how to identify those signs and symptoms and how to help out someone that we know that they can be in that situation. Because sometimes we don't see in reality that domestic abuse doesn't only come in the physical form, it also appears in emotional abuse as well. So thank you.
So Emily, tell us about you and how you got involved with Women in Distress.
Yeah, no, I want to say thanks again for having me. I think domestic violence, every time I get invited to speak about it, I'm always really impressed because it is a hard topic. So thank you for highlighting this as part of your podcast. I kind of found it accidentally. So I got involved in social work, which is a really, really big field. There's so many different specialized populations and things you can work in. And I did an internship with the state attorney's office up in Tallahassee where I was going to school. And of course, in that victim advocate unit, we work with all sorts of violent crime, ranging from murder to aggravated theft and all sorts of things, but sexual violence. But, 15% of all violent crime nationwide is domestic violence. It's
15%.
15%. It's a really big piece of the pie. So as an intern, that's what we ended up working the most on because that's what we saw the most. And the more I met with survivors and I learned from the advocates around me, and I just realized like this is really cool work. And I just found my niche in it, and I've been doing it since. I moved back down to South Florida where I partially grew up and got into prevention work at Women in Distress.
Wow.
Nice.
Yeah. Tell us, so let's put some definitions out there. Sure. What exactly is domestic violence?
So domestic violence is a system or a pattern of power and control in a relationship. And it's different forms. That's why we have different forms of abuse. When you look at the legal definition, and especially in the state of Florida where we are, it's very much rooted in, physical violence or sexual violence or stalking. It's very situational, right? This incident happened on this date. What we really know about domestic violence outside of that legal definition is it's about the dynamic of the relationship, right? So the names that they call you, the way that they put pressure on you, the way the financial control starts to seep in.
Financial control.
Yeah. So financial abuse, I feel like I'm just spitting out some
Yes, please.
Financial abuse happens in upwards of 90% of abusive relationships. It's one of the most common forms of abuse, but it's also one of the least talked about. But think about it too, especially if you're getting serious with someone, maybe you move in, maybe you even get married. Of course, finances are going to be part of that. What often happens in abusive relationships, again, when we start thinking about it as power and control, is that, okay, don't worry about that. If you really trust in me, I can handle the bills. I can do this. And you don't have to work. If you really wanted a family, I thought we agreed that you'd stay home. And my career, if you really want to support me, you got to put my career first. And it's kind of using these like normal social norms, but it's taking them in a direction of, okay, how do I get what I want? And I don't really care what you want. And that's why we say it's about power and control. It's not like I want to be violent and I want to hurt someone. It's I feel entitled to this role in the relationship, and here are the different ways that I'm doing that. And
I'm sure that for the victims that they don't really see it coming because they present it in a certain way that you're like, oh, you know what, that makes sense. And little by little, they take everything.
Yeah, it's like you said, and it's almost like you think of it as, oh, he or she wants to just take care of me, and I don't have to worry about the bills, and he's, and it presents itself in such a different way that you don't see it coming.
Well, right, and we hear from a lot of survivors that there's like this like second voice, like that shadow voice that's like, I don't love that, but I guess it's fine.
Those red flags that we choose to ignore sometimes.
Exactly, and that's it too. Nobody wants to be a survivor of DV. There's no one in our shelter right now who's so excited to be there. Nobody wants to be abused in a relationship. So if we could see the red flags or see into the future clearly, nobody would stay or they would leave or they'd be able to kind of deal with it. But I like to use the metaphor of frog in the water. You may have heard this, or I think it's like floating around somewhere on social media. But, if you have a pot of boiling water and you throw a frog in, the frog's going to jump right out and be like, oh my gosh, I don't want to be in there.
It's a reflex.
It's a reflex. But if I'm in a tepid water or the frog's in the tepid water and we slowly turn up the heat,
you get used to it.
It takes a little bit before you make that leap.
And that's how boundaries are pushed in abusive relationships. It's little things that maybe, okay, I guess just this time or whatever. until your boundary started here. And now with tiny little inches, you're now way over here.
So that's why this is, I think it's something very, very important to us, is that we need to break down that stigma, not only for the victims to be feeling that, oh, I don't want to be a victim, or I don't want to be seen as this weak person, but it is okay. We need to be aware of the situation that we are in, and hopefully someone that can help us be pulled out of that situation. Yeah. And that is where Women in Distress is starting to do a role with that.
Absolutely. So we're one of the certified domestic violence centers in the state of Florida. So we're separate from the government. We're separate from law enforcement. We are a nonprofit agency whose sole mission is to help and serve survivors of domestic violence and their families. And a big way we do that, when you talk about supporting survivors, when I do our new hire training, I always say you don't have to have exactly the right words. You don't need to have been an advocate for years and years and years. You have to be willing to show up, and you have to be willing to look at the person in front of you and say, you do not deserve what happened to you. What do you need? What do you want? How can I help you return to yourself?
That was really powerful right there. That was beautiful.
That's something we can all do with intention. I think people get scared of this topic because we don't want to make it worse.
Yeah.
Right. And we also don't want to put ourselves in danger.
Yeah.
One way we can step into the conversation with someone who's going through it, or even like you both are doing and bringing this subject to light, is let me just ask, right? Yeah. We don't have to have all the answers. Often each one of us has the answers we need. It's just, I need someone to help me figure it out. I need someone to believe in me, give me that little kernel of truth, because especially with the emotional abuse in relationships, a lot of survivors, even the strongest people, your self-esteem gets worn away. You start to question yourself.
Your self-worth.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so a lot of the survivors, by the time they're reaching out to us, or they're even reaching out to family and friends, there's so much shame, there's so much embarrassment, and there's so much, I don't even know what's real anymore. So by us showing up and saying, well, help me understand what's real for you. Let's figure it out together. Yeah. I'm here for this road trip with you until you kick me out of the car. And we kind of see it as that instead of do this, do that, and here's how to get out.
And just the simple fact that you are listening to them, right? I think sometimes people just want to be heard. And so they come to you guys and they're telling you this and this and this is going on. And they just want to be heard. Like, how do I get out of this? What do I do?
Right.
Speaking their truth.
Yeah. And I know you mentioned before we were starting to record that part of your goals with this podcast is to empower. Right?
Yes.
I love that word.
Empower and inspire.
Yeah. Yes. So we utilize what's called empowerment-based philosophies in service, which is exactly what you just said. It's, I want to empower not by telling you what to do, but by listening, by helping really see and giving you space. Because a lot of people in abusive relationships, I think you're right to say we often don't listen well enough in general. Where we're always listening to say, well, how can I jump in? What can I say next? Yep. When we pause that for ourselves, but especially with victims of domestic violence, us as advocates, we really try to practice. Let me put all my judgments aside. Let me put all the previous survivors I've talked to. Let me put everything else aside and enter your world with you. And you kind of have to, that's where empathy comes in, right? Empathy is, I'm willing to open this door to this emotion that you're feeling and step inside that with you so I can understand it and help if you want me to.
I told you, she is a special human being.
And it comes so natural.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know, aside, what are the majority of victims? Like, what are the age frames or the backgrounds of the victims that you deal with?
Yeah, great question. I will say, domestic violence happens in all communities, to all genders, races, ethnicities, socioeconomic status, all of that, particularly in our services and mostly around the country. The most common age demographic is women ages 18 to 34. Which kind of makes sense, right? You're getting maybe into your first serious relationships. We're starting to have children. You might start to get married or, long-term partnerships. And that's where we see a lot of the folks accessing services. And that doesn't mean it doesn't happen to older folks or teens. It's actually right now in February, Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month. It does happen to teenagers too. Wow. But the most common demographic, it still primarily is a violence against women issue. And that's not an accident. That's due to historical forms of oppression and things like that. But, we do see victims all across the board as well.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. So, ages 18 to 34 for the most part. Right. But it is Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month. Yep. Let's touch on that for a second because I think it's important. What advice do you give moms listening to you right now that maybe they're starting to see their daughters, their sons too, because we know it can happen to men also. What advice do you give if they start to see these red flags or hey mom, sharing stories. Mom, I went through this last night, or maybe not sharing with their mom or dad, but they're starting to pick up on different behaviors. Things are. What do you suggest?
Yeah, I will caveat this answer with I am not a parent. Every time I talk to parents, I'm like, I don't know how hard your life is. But really, it's take them seriously. A big thing we do as adults sometimes is we downplay young people's experiences, particularly when it comes to relationships. Because what do we think as adults? You're going to have more relationships. This is puppy love. And that may be true in some circumstances, but it doesn't mean the emotions they're feeling at that time aren't any less real. So I always, if parents ask, I always say, take it seriously and ask more questions. It goes back to listening, what we were saying earlier. Don't assume A, your child's experience, or B, how they feel about that experience. But more and more, I think younger generations, particularly going through COVID, I think they're much more aware of mental health issues, which is great. They often have language to talk about it. It's giving them the space and the trust. Yeah. So I tell parents too, often it's preemptive, it's preventative. Have those hard conversations with your child before anything ever happens. Say to them very blatantly, I want you to come to me about anything. You're not going to get in trouble. We're on the same team. There might be consequences, but I care about your safety. I love you first and foremost. Because that's what's going to create that trusted relationship, right? Where, okay, mom and dad, this person, I sent nude pictures. He pressured me. I thought it was okay. Now I'm trying to break up with him and he's threatening to share them across the whole school.
But that goes back down to that trust that the parent has with their teenage. Yeah. Because sometimes someone can be in an environment with a family that they don't really feel that trust with a parent, with a sibling, with not even with a friend to be able to open good enough.
And it's hard. Yeah. It's really hard to open up. I mean, think about any time we're talking about mental health in general. Yeah. It's hard to open up about mental health struggles, even when you can almost guarantee a trusted friend or family member support. So the more as we on the listening or receiving end can validate and reassure, hey, if you ever need anything, I'm here for you.
And that's exactly what we are here for. We're
and you're doing a great job. We love it.
About everything that is surrounded mental health, our emotions, our thoughts, how everything influences in the way that ultimately how we live the lives that we want to live. And also going back to the signs that we were talking about on those red flags, what is the most common patterns that you have seen for all of these victims? Starting from those red flags, the controlling behavior, but what is something that would entitle someone to say like, hey, hold on, I think something's going on here?
Sure, a great question, and really important to know as we're trying to support it. There, every DV case really is unique, but some of the more common factors we see and hear are isolation. If you obviously, like, especially when people first get into relationships, of course, they're going to want to be with their partner. There's the honeymoon stage, right? And they want to spend 24/7. They love bombarding
Netflix and chill, and they want to just hang out at home.
Cool beans, that's pretty normal. But if it starts to get, past that, and you never see your friend by themselves, they're always with their partner, or they're always, by their phone. There's a sense of urgency. I always say you can almost feel it before you can name it. We can often sense when something's wrong with the people around us.
Sense of urgency.
Yeah, like hey, how long is this going to take? My boyfriend needs me to text him, or I told him I would FaceTime when we get here. Yeah. Location, the pressure to location share. Now, if you're choosing that, again, this is book control, right? And boundaries. Yep. If you choose that of like, I want my partner to know where I am in these circumstances or all the time, that is a choice that you can make in a healthy way. But it's also something that we see a lot of partners pressure. Hey, well, if you're, why do you care if I see where you're at? If you're not anywhere you're not supposed to be, even think about that language, right? You're not supposed to be.
It's good to differentiate between how you choose to carry on your relationship, because I trust my partner, and it's like some safety checks that we do. Other is like, I have to. Otherwise, it's going to get mad, or it's going to be passive aggressive.
I told him I was going to be here 20 minutes. I'm going on 30 minutes. Oh my God, when is this over? When are we going to... Yep. I told them I would only be gone for this long. It's like you said, that sense of urgency, and you're looking at your phone, you're like...
Yep. And that's where we get to, like, when I was talking about power and control, right? Those sound like really big, scary words, but that's really what we mean is boundaries, right? It's, am I deciding that we have this boundary? Is this an equal decision or is this an unequal decision? Yeah. So behaviors can look the same on the surface, but we really need to investigate is, well, where did that actually come from and who's making the decisions here? Boundary pushing, even making you feel guilty. I didn't really want to, but I guess just this one time, if you really love me, you would. I don't know why you're making such a big deal out of this, right? A lot of threats and coercion aren't, if you don't do this, I'm going to hurt you. That sometimes, especially when things escalate, it can get like that. But a lot of the time, we do this to our friends sometimes too, right? We push them in ways that are not okay.
They victimize themselves, make you feel like, take advantage that maybe you have a good heart, you're an empath, you're like, oh my God, no.
Yep. Yeah, they put it on you that you're the problem. And that's what we hear from a lot of survivors when the emotional abuse starts to come up, is I felt like I was always wrong and he was always right or she was always right.
You're questioning yourself.
Feel like I'm it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And that's, I think emotional abuse happens in almost all abusive relationships. And that's often where it starts, right? Yeah. Abusive relationships don't start out of the gate often physically or sexually violent. It's often the emotional abuse, the verbal abuse, the things, we talk about the health of a relationship on a spectrum. So on the healthy side, both people are comfortable. It's not that
both people are at peace.
Both people are at peace. Yeah, that's a great way to say it. And it's not that we don't have arguments. We're different people. I'm sure if we hung out enough, we'd find we disagree on some stuff, That's normal human behavior, but it's how do you handle those disagreements? Yeah. That's healthy. If you feel comfortable, you feel content, you feel safe. Unhealthy is, I'm starting to feel a little uncomfortable. Yeah. Maybe I don't feel scared, but I just feel like something's a little off, or maybe this just isn't for me. Yeah. I'm feeling a little pressured, but I've been able to hold my own. And then where it really shifts from unhealthy to abusive is the presence of fear. Yeah. No longer am I just like uncomfortable. I'm now upset. I'm fearful for my emotional health, my mental health, my physical safety. And that's really where that line gets crossed.
It's so scary.
Yeah, it is.
What are some of the psychological, like long-term effects that you see from the survivors of domestic violence?
Yeah, and it can vary based on the type of abuse or the intensity of the abuse. And trauma shows up in so many different ways. I think there's so much amazing new literature coming out about trauma, even the way it shows up in our bodies. But kind of on a more general level, when we talk about trauma and just the ongoing, again, think about it as a dynamic. You're living in this fearful environment. You're not just experiencing incidents of violence. You're living in this environment where you feel controlled
all the time.
Yeah. So we see fight, flight, even freeze or fawn, right? How am I surviving? And that's really what it is. We say survivor with a lot of intention. These folks aren't victims. They're actively surviving their situation. They're doing a lot. They're doing way more than we often realize to keep themselves and their kids safe. But the other piece is they are surviving through this. They're learning mechanisms, right? So they might start, safety planning and getting different, like they're kind of always in survival mode. I don't know how else to describe it. But that can lead to tension. It can lead to depression. We see PTSD symptoms sometimes, that ongoing low self-esteem.
The
anxiety, feeling like they're not a good enough parent. It could lead to troubles at work, especially if they're going through a situation. Now they've got to take time off of work to go to court or go to therapy. And they start to kind of, feel like, well, now I can't handle this. So it's a snowball effect for a lot of survivors, but it definitely depression, anxiety. A lot of folks experience that, unfortunately.
Emily, right now.
Yes.
Let's assume that there's somebody listening to you right now that's going through this.
Sure.
What advice would you give them?
First, believe yourself that you are not at fault. You are not at fault for what was done to you. Nothing you could have done would have changed their behavior. A lot of survivors we talk to say, well, if I had just gotten dinner ready on time, if I would have seen that coming, if I would have known the red flags, if I would have picked up the kids, they would have found another excuse because it's not about what you're doing. It's about what they want. So A, it is not your fault. Yeah. B, reach out when you're ready and to who you feel comfortable to. There is not one right way to navigate DV. You can always call 911 if that's something you feel comfortable with and you feel like you're in immediate danger. There are domestic violence centers. So if you're in Broward, women in distress, you can call our hotline 24/7. There's also certified centers throughout the state of Florida and throughout the country. So no matter where you're listening or watching, there is a domestic violence center in your area. And there's also the national hotline.
Can you repeat that? There is a domestic violence center?
Yes, there's a domestic violence center. And I recommend if you have a safe phone or computer to Google. If you Google domestic violence, immediately the national number comes up. Even if you're just looking for statistics, it comes up. That's a great resource too. If you just, sometimes it takes that first step to talk to somebody. Maybe you're not ready to jump into services, but you just want to practice telling your story and see what that feels like and get that validation. So,
and there is something that, because I remember seeing, I don't remember where, like a sign that they can, like a silent sign that can be said someone publicly. So someone is able to pick up that sign like, hey, this person it's asking for help. They cannot speak out right now.
I think I heard of that. Yeah,
yes.
There's something.
There's a few. The only issue we have with that, and I think it's a really well-intentioned idea for whoever's been coming up with them, is kind of like we're saying, we kind of recognize it, but not. So if I'm silently signaling or a survivor's thinking, well, maybe if I silently signal, it's actually much more effective to reach out directly for help. Where that becomes really useful is things like unsafe dates. So if you're going on a date, maybe you met this person through an app. A lot of bars and restaurants now have like, and they usually post them in the women's bathrooms, but some are even posting them everywhere of like, ask for a specific drink at the bar.
Yes.
And if you want a taxi called, ask for it on the rocks. And, you know, that way, but that's a trained system where those bartenders know exactly how. Bystander intervention works when we have a specific procedure to follow. So I always say with the silent signals, it's often best to kind of just be more forward, even with things like healthcare professionals and all. But in settings like that, where there's a system set up, that can be really powerful for somebody to get help.
So I think that's something that the victims may be afraid of is the retaliation. What if they get caught making that phone call or Googling information about it?
Yeah. And that's actually one of the best things we can do as somebody that wants to help in a way that's a safe way for us to get involved is offer your own cell phone. Hey, I know I mentioned that hotline to you, or you want to look up information. Would you feel more comfortable doing that from my phone? Or is there a work phone you can use? You know, when we talk about safety planning, that can sometimes feel really technical, but that's also safety planning is, hey, I'm offering you a resource. How can I make sure you can access it safely? So you're exactly right. A lot of survivors fear, what if he can see that I Googled this? What if someone else, maybe I'm using a public library computer and I don't want a public person to see me.
Right.
So I love that you brought that up. That's a really important thing to think about.
What differs Women in Distress from any other organization against domestic violence?
Part of it is that we've been doing this work for so long. So we were founded in 1974, which I know we're actually in our 50th year, which is super exciting. And it's hard to believe. I mean, I haven't been.
Although you're not 50.
No. But, you know, when you look at not to get too nerdy, but I definitely can, the history of the battered women's movement, it was called at the time in the United States, really only started in the 70s, which is kind of upsetting when you think about domestic violence has been something since ancient biblical times, you know, but in our country and even around the world, you know, the first domestic violence shelter was founded in the U.S. in 1973. And then 1974, WID came along. We actually started as a homeless shelter for women and children. And then we realized so many folks they were coming because they were leaving abusive households and they had nowhere else to go. But kind of over time, in those ensuing decades, so much more advocacy and education and survivors speaking out and so much advocacy even at the legislative level really started to shape domestic violence as the public health issue and the public issue that it is, not just a private emotional issue. So all of that to say, WID has kind of had that framework for a really long time. And so we have a really good relationship with a lot of folks in Broward County where we focus most of our services. We work closely with police departments, with the schools. Me and my team actually go out into the schools and talk with high school and middle school students. So we have a really good network of folks that are supporting survivors so that survivors can get to help in the way that they want to and that feels best for them.
Let me ask you this. So a survivor gets to the shelter. And what does that look like? How long are they there?
Yeah, great question. I think the shelter is maybe one of the most mysterious things about what we do, right? It's communal living, so it's safe, it's clean, but you know, it's dorm style living. The typical stay is about 6 weeks, which is not a lot of time when you think about rebuilding, even in the best of circumstances, right? But it is an emergency shelter. We're actually working right now on building a transitional housing program that would give survivors long-term 1 to 2 year stays to really focus on the long-term stuff, which we're really excited about. But right now, our emergency shelter is that safe place for them to go when they're in a dangerous situation. They need to get out. They have nowhere else to go, either financially or socially or logistically, and they can come and have a safe place with their kids.
So somebody calls the hotline and they're telling you or whomever answers the phone, they're in a very dangerous situation. Are they typically advised to come into the shelter, or how does that look like?
We essentially ask them. So if somebody had said that on the phone, the first question we ask when somebody calls the hotline is, are you in a safe place to talk? Because maybe law enforcement showed up and just gave them the phone, or maybe, a well-meaning family or friend, but they're not sure what they want. Yeah. So if I'm hearing it and they're saying, yeah, I'm really scared. He just got arrested last night. I don't know what I'm going to do when he gets out. I don't feel safe staying here. That's where we can start to give options. Well, we do have a shelter, or is there anyone else you've considered staying with? Well, my mom lives in town, but she's, not really supportive. She loves him or doesn't really understand what's going on. And he knows where she is anyway. Okay. So then we start to kind of see, we through conversation, try to identify their biggest needs. Yeah. And then if one of their big needs is shelter, they don't seem to have another place to go, it's where we can start explaining, and not everybody is a good fit or wants shelter or needs shelter. We actually have an outreach program too that works with survivors at any stage in the abusive relationship, whether they're still in it, they're planning to leave, they've left 5 or 10 years ago. Because, there's so much else to work on. Not everybody needs that shelter, but for the folks that do, that's how that conversation typically goes.
Wow. I just feel that the Women in Distress, the organization, is just, it's amazing, the work that you guys do and helping these survivors, because they are survivors, right? And
absolutely.
And really regain their life and transition back into society, because I think that must be so difficult. Let's assume 6 weeks, right? Sure. They're in the center, and then it's almost like, well, what now? What do I do now with my life?
Yeah. And think about any breakup is hard. It could be a life-shifting thing. When abuse is part of the mix, and if you have children or not, you're absolutely right. It can be a really difficult transition. I'm really proud of the work that WID does. I'm one of almost 100 staff, so I'm a tiny slice of representation for the agency, but there are so many committed therapists and advocates and hotline advocates, and we have a team of lawyers. We have all of these resources. Right. And again, a big way is we ask them what they need and their pace. There are some folks that can hit the ground running. They get that steam and they move forward. They might move to a different state or a different county. They might be really invested in their career. Other folks might need a little bit more guidance. They might leave our shelter but then continue an outreach. But all along the way, no matter what path they choose, we try to continually instill that sense of empowerment. Empowerment doesn't happen in 6 weeks. And it doesn't happen overnight. It's actually, I think, a lifelong thing, even for those of us who aren't actively in a DV situation, right? We're constantly
trying to grow
and learn and invest in ourselves, I think.
And we were actually talking about something like this, that the person that we are today would have handled any situation similar like that, like back, let's say 10 years ago, completely differently.
Sure.
Maybe now as we grow, we learn so many things. We build this person that you put them in that situation, and they set those boundaries. They know how to get away at the first red flag. Like, no, you don't serve me. I don't need you. But it's difficult when you're in that vulnerable stage that you're looking maybe to fit with someone. You're looking that love from someone.
Yeah.
So
no, I love it. I love the way you said that. I think we're always growing on different versions of ourselves, and some of what we try to instill in survivors too is, I can show you that I trust you and I believe in you and I believe in your worth, but that's not going to matter unless you do. So I think a lot of advocacy is mirrors, right? Yep. Let me just hold that up for you and help you see that and forgive your past self, forgive even if you want to your abuser, but however moving on looks like for you. But I love that we hold so much shame in ourselves. I think especially as women too. We're constantly putting ourselves down instead of looking at giving ourselves grace, and letting ourselves grow and make mistakes.
I was sharing with Camilla, and this is, and I talk about, this podcast really is for anyone that wants to empower themselves and really grow and look at, a better version of themselves every single day, and part of that is, and I have to be completely vulnerable now, is that I was in a situation probably about 15 years ago, and it was a very emotionally abusive relationship. And it got physical too. It got really bad. There was one night that he threw me out of a moving car, and I'm alive today, thank God, because of my mother and my sisters and other very powerful women that helped me get out of this. But, I think it's important for everyone listening, especially because we were talking about it this morning. What about those friends, right, that hear their friend going through it and they're constantly giving them advice, but she doesn't leave. Or he doesn't leave the situation. What do you tell them? Do you tell them just remain supportive? What do you say to that person?
Yeah, stay on their team. I would say if we had a golden rule book of how to get out of an abusive relationship, we'd be publishing it. We'd send it. We put it on billboards. There's not one way to do this. So often it's not about giving advice. It's about asking, what do you need right now? Yeah. Maybe it's just, I need to be able to vent about this with somebody, or, I'm going to try to call this hotline. Can you be in the room with me? Yeah. And it is frustrating. We're humans. Yeah. Sorry, I touched my mic. We're humans. We're not immune to seeing our friends go through pain. We can get frustrated, but I think I was sharing with this with you before we started recording. It takes an average of 7 times for a victim or a survivor to leave an abusive relationship before she leaves for good. Yeah. Think about that, what that means in real life. I'm your friend. I'm even an advocate. I see you leave one time, I'm cheering you on, I'm doing all the best things that we've been talking about. And then you go back. And I say, okay, abuse is hard. I get it. You've been with him for so long. Am I going to be the same empathetic, non-judgmental, supportive person the 6th, the 7th, the 9th, the 10th time? I should be, but that's going to take a lot of intention. Yeah, so we got to kind of back up on our judgment and really just say, again, every time, because whose fault is it that they continue to get abused when they go back? It's the abuser who continues to choose to abuse them, right? We focus on the wrong party when the accountability. Yeah. So it's.
I love that you said that.
It's huge, you know? And
because you start to blame that person and you're like, well, why can't you just get out of this situation? I've told you a million times, but and you keep going back.
And I love that we're touching that subject. I think that culturally, that has a lot to do with it. Like, we come from from the Cuban background that, you know, like, ay, mija, like, you're always with the same story, like, leave him already. Like, at some point, we lose track of that intention that you just mentioned. And we're just like, okay, this is the whole story. Nothing's going to change. Either we don't see it from the outside as serious until that first physical altercation happens, or we just, in the family, we just forget it. Like that saying that the Latins have.
Lo que pasa
entre marido y mujer, you know, like what happens between husband and wife.
What happens between husband and wife or between a couple stays there. Like you don't get involved.
That's to a certain extent. And we need to remind the community out there that that's until a certain extent. Yes, you respect that relationship, but then you have to, you know, you have to pick up on those things and not look the other way.
Do your part. Do your part and help each other out. And I'm just so happy you're here.
I am too. No, really. Thank you so much for the platform and the questions. I mean, I think this is so important.
That we'll do a part 2, 3, or 4, how many needed. Like we will get the feedback. Anybody that is in a similar situation or needs more of those resources, like that's what we're here for. That's what we're breaking barriers.
Yeah. Guys, I just want to say thank you one last time to Emily. You are, and I keep saying this because you need to understand that you have such a powerful voice.
Yeah, thank you.
And what you're doing in this world and how you're serving our community. Look at me, I'm getting all teary-eyed. You are a special, special person. And I just think the world of you, and you're just a light in this world. So please continue to educate. You're, like we said in the beginning of the podcast, you're the education and prevention manager for women in distress. And just never lose sight of how special you are and what you're doing.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Guys, for all of you listening, we ask you to please follow us on social media, which is Breaking Barriers, the podcast. Engage with us in our social media. Send us your questions, your feedback. We will get you the answers that you're looking for. And thank you. Thank you for being here. And until next time on our next episode.